Catalyst Global website. So thank you again for joining us today, and I'll hand it back to Danielle.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tab. My name is Danielle Harris, and I am a Senior Program Manager with Catalyst Global and on the USAID-funded Expanding Effective Contraceptive Options Project, better known as the EECO project. And today I'm excited to share an in-depth look at the methods and findings of a literature review that was completed by the EECO project on the barriers and enablers to use of vaginally inserted contraceptive methods. For those of you who attended the TAG in June, some of this information will be familiar, but we're also going to dig into the method-specific findings today, which we didn't have time to do during the TAG. And just so everyone knows, this work was recently published by Studies in Family Planning, so I will share the citation and link with everyone in the chat later on. And everything that I'm discussing today is presented in the paper. In the publication, we also include quite a bit of supplemental information, so you're welcome to check all of that out in case you're interested in our search terms, to the Gray Literature websites that we searched, our code list, and a final list of the included articles. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. So to start, I wanted to remind everyone of the rationale, of the rationale and objectives of our literature review. In terms of the rationale, we know that use of vaginally inserted contraceptive methods is generally low when compared with other methods in low and middle income countries. And yet the characteristics of these methods often align with the stated preferences of women who have an unmet need for contraception. So for example, women's top reasons for not using contraception include side effects and infrequent sex. And some vaginally inserted contraceptive methods are barrier methods with no side effects or have very minimal side effects due to local action in the uterus. And some vaginal methods can also be used on demand, which may be compatible with the preferences of women who have infrequent sex and don't want to use contraception continuously. We also know that some reproductive health experts have argued, at least in the past, that demand for vaginally inserted contraceptive methods is diminished by embarrassment or taboos related to women or their providers touching their genitals. So this is something that we wanted to further investigate as well. And to reiterate, our objectives in this review were to identify barriers and enablers for both adoption and continuation, and then using that information, think through opportunities for family planning implementers like us and many of you on the line to design and adjust programs in response to them. So in service of our research objectives, we searched both peer-reviewed and Gray literature. For the peer-reviewed literature, we searched 3 databases, and those are PubMed, Embase, and Web of Science, with a combination of search terms related to the method itself, terms related to barriers and enablers, and then also geography. For the Gray literature, we searched 18 websites. Some of those are partner websites, some relevant repositories, and with a similar but abbreviated list of search terms. I've also included our inclusion and exclusion criteria on the slide, and I won't read through all of it, but I did want to highlight a couple of things. First, I wanted to highlight the 5 contraceptive methods that we focused on, which include the diaphragm, the vaginal ring, the female condom, the hormonal IUD, and the copper IUD. We also focused on research conducted in low and middle income countries per the World Bank definition. And lastly, our review did include some multi-purpose prevention technologies, or MPTs, like female condoms that offer protection from HIV and unintended pregnancy. However, we do think that our results may be relevant to vaginally inserted HIV products. So at the end of our search, where we cast a very wide net, we had nearly 14,000 articles. After removing duplicates, about 9,000 moved on to title abstract review, and ultimately 182 were included in the analysis. The primary reasons for exclusion were that the article wasn't relevant, was from a high income country, or that the full text wasn't available for review. In the published manuscript, you can see our Prisma flow diagram where we break these numbers down in more detail. In terms of the process for both the title and abstract and full text reviews, we had 2 authors screen the results independently, and any disagreements were resolved by a 3rd author. For the included articles, the data was extracted by 1 author using an Excel template that we developed for this purpose, and then was reviewed by a 2nd author for accuracy. For the analysis, we developed a framework and a list of code that were related to barriers and enablers that influence contraceptive adoption and continuation. We identified these demand-side factors based on a number of different behavioral theories that are commonly used in family planning research and implementation. And then using the V1 of our codes, if you will, 3 of the authors applied them to a random subset of results. And then based on this exercise, we reviewed the discrepancies and talked with the larger authorship team to kind of standardize our approach, and also figure out if we needed to add more codes with greater specificity. So from there, the rest of the results were coded by 3 authors, and as needed, we kind of repeated that process where we regrouped with the full authorship team and figured out how to standardize and move forward. We also did random spot checks throughout this process to make sure that the authors responsible for coding were on the same page. And after coding, the findings were tabulated by the contraceptive method and code to identify themes that were common across methods as well as unique to specific methods. And then these findings were further disaggregated to see whether they applied to adoption versus continuation. All right, and on to the exciting part, the findings. So as I mentioned, we looked at the enablers and barriers in 2 ways. First, across methods in terms of which were most commonly shared, and we applied a weighting of the results to do this, and then for each specific method. So first, I'll be sharing the highlights across methods. For adoption, quality counseling by a trained provider or community health worker was an enabler across all methods. Alignment between a woman's preferences and a method's duration of use was also an enabler to all methods except for the female condom, which is a single-use on-demand method. Whatever women deemed to be an acceptable side effect profile was also an enabler to adoption of several methods. And then I've listed a few other enablers here, including if the method was non-hormonal, reversible, or recommended in someone's network, a user's network. One note I did want to make is that in the published paper, all of these results are in table 2, and you'd be able to see that dual protection is listed as an enabler for adoption of the diaphragm and vaginal ring as well. Right now, the diaphragm and vaginal ring do not provide dual protection from HIV and unintended pregnancy, but some of the studies that were included in our review assessed women's interest in an MPT version of these methods. So that's why it appears there. In terms of method continuation, for which there are fewer results, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when discussing the limitations, the enabling factors across methods were, again, alignment between a woman's preferences and a method's duration of use, user satisfaction, including sexual satisfaction, and a positive partner experience. So that means a partner's positive attitudes toward the method's use and also their sexual satisfaction as well. Now, turning our attention to barriers across methods, lack of familiarity with the methods and product cost were barriers to adoption for all methods. Note that the product cost remains a concern even when a method is offered in the public sector, where the method itself might be free, but there are other user fees required or transportation costs, etc. Other barriers to adoption include negative partner attitudes, anticipated side effects, myths and misconceptions. I've also included concerns about insertion here with an asterisk because there's some important nuance, which is that among women's concerns about insertion, it was mostly related to the method size, which was more common for the female condom and vaginal ring, for example, where they were worried about the insertion process being painful, or they were concerned that the method would stay in place during sex or other activities. Was a very small number of studies that reported that women felt awkward or embarrassed about touching their genitals or having a provider do so, which was an important finding for us. And I'll talk more about a little later in the presentation. In terms of continuation across methods, the most common barriers were negative partner attitudes, side effects, and negative impacts on user or their partner's sexual satisfaction and a method's general comfort and fit. All right, so now we'll get into some of the method-specific findings, which I think are really interesting and valuable for those of us who are focusing on introduction or scale-up of specific methods. So the diaphragm was the least represented in the literature of the methods that we looked at. We had 10 studies that were feeding into the results on adoption and 10 feeding into the continuation findings. So it's a pretty small number. And I note that even though it's 10 and 10, they're not necessarily the same 10 articles. And that'll be the same for the diaphragm and the vaginal ring. It looks like the same number of articles for both, but there's some overlap there. So you'll notice that for the diaphragm, the enablers really focus on the self-care nature of the method, that it's woman-controlled, it can be used on demand, it can be self-inserted and self-removed. For the barriers, we know that many women aren't familiar with diaphragms. It's a new product category for a lot of women, and they might be concerned about figuring out how to insert it at first. So that's where that barrier comes from. And then for the Kaya diaphragm, for example, it's also indicated for use with a contraceptive gel. And for some women, that's a barrier because it's inconvenient or, depending on the context, could be a recurring cost. For the vaginal ring, we had 13 studies feeding into the adoption findings and 13 feeding into the continuation findings. In terms of the enablers for adoption, we saw a lot of themes around quality counseling. So counseling by a trained provider or CHW and the use of counseling tools. And for continuation, we found user satisfaction, including sexual satisfaction, and increased comfort with self-insertion to be important factors. For the barriers, there were concerns about product performance. So that would be effectiveness and whether the method might slip out. As a hormonal method, there were also concerns about side effects. And concerns about partners was another barrier, specifically how women might convince their partners to try this new method, especially if there is shared decision-making around contraceptive use and the associated cost. For the female condom, we had 36 studies feeding into the adoption findings and 21 into the continuation findings. Similar to the diaphragm, the enablers for adoption focus on the self-care, self-use nature of the method. And interestingly enough, sexual satisfaction for both users and their partners were important enablers for continued use. In terms of barriers, a lack of familiarity with the product, partner attitudes, and the size of the product, normally that it was deemed too big, were barriers to adoption. Barriers to continuation were comfort and fit, and partners who weren't supportive of using the method or felt that it negatively impacted their sexual satisfaction. The copper IUD was the most represented method in the literature. We had 90 studies contributing to the findings on adoption and 43 on continuation. The enablers here are pretty similar for adoption and continuation, which include quality counseling by a trained provider or CHW, really so that women know what to expect about the process and the side effects and have an opportunity to ask questions. And the method's duration of use was also an enabler. Side effects were a big barrier for adoption and continuation, as were negative partner attitudes. And then for adoption, myths and misconceptions about the product were also a significant barrier. That includes things like many things that we've heard before, but that the copper IUD causes cancer, or that it can only be used by certain types of women, like women who have already had children or women who are married. And for poor product performance, which is listed as a barrier to continuation, that's mainly related to concerns or experiences of expulsion or migration of the copper IUD.
Where does it go?
And last but not least, we looked at the literature on the hormonal IUD. We had 18 studies or resources feeding into the findings on adoption and 9 to the findings on continuation. Enablers for adoption included an acceptable side effect profile, the method's duration of use, and the fact that it's a highly effective method. The topic of side effects is an interesting one for the hormonal IUD, but I don't think it will be surprising to this crowd. I say that because in this graph, you'll see side effects in multiple places. And that's because for some women, the anticipated side effects are a reason for choosing the method. And for other women, it's a reason to not choose the method. Similar to continuation, the experienced side effects for some women make them want to continue using it, and for others make them want to discontinue use. And while we're talking about side effects pretty broadly in terms of this review, for the hormonal IUD, this does center around bleeding changes. Other barriers for adoption were cost and concerns about insertion, which was primarily due to fears about pain during insertion by a provider, and to a lesser extent, modesty. So at this point, you can probably tell that our review is pretty extensive, but I did want to mention a few important limitations. For one, we focused on demand side barriers and enablers, which was our plan all along, but that does mean that our analysis and findings can't take provider or other supply or system level factors into account. Also, in the end, we had about 2,000 findings across the 182 included articles. Within these findings, though, there are some noticeable skews or notable skews. One is that there are a lot more articles and findings on adoption than there are continuation. And two, that there's a lot more literature about some methods compared to others. So for example, of the 182 included articles, 100 were on the copper IUD, whereas 12 were on the diaphragm. Also, our review wasn't systematic in that we didn't evaluate the strength of each study that was included or eliminate studies with small sample sizes, which could affect the representativeness of our results. We also didn't look at geographic clustering of barriers and enablers. We only recorded the geographies where they came from, which is included in the paper. And onto some of our final insights and implications. One, if not the biggest for us, was that vaginal insertion was not a major barrier to adoption of these methods. For women who were concerned about insertion, as I said before, it was primarily about the size of the method, whether it would remain in place during sex or become dislodged during sex or other activities, whether insertion would be painful. And we did find that in some cases, discomfort with vaginal insertion diminished over time as women gained more experience and confidence using a method. This is particularly salient with the vaginal ring, for example. Of the 182 articles that we included in our analysis, only 6 found that women explicitly stated their discomfort touching their vaginas to insert the method, or stating that they felt embarrassed about the insertion process. And this was more so if the provider was male. This finding is important because it suggests that reproductive health experts may have overestimated concerns about vaginal insertion and its impact on demand for these methods. And this is kind of a rumor that you see reused and repurposed over time. So we are excited to have some evidence contrary to that. Another takeaway, which is something I think the people on this call won't be comfortable with, but bears emphasizing, is that women's contraceptive preferences are diverse. What's a barrier for some women is an enabler for another. And that's why having a full suite of choice is so important for meeting women's needs and preferences, both now and over the course of their lifetimes. Some of the programmatic actions that we think would be the most impactful in supporting women's voluntary adoption of vaginal methods would be to focus on quality counseling and the use of counseling tools. So that means providing full information about a method's benefits and side effects, letting women know what to expect with insertion, whether they do it themselves or a provider does it. When relevant, allowing women to practice insertion or take advantage of supplemental materials on the process, be it videos or printed instructions, and also giving women a chance to ask questions and clarify the myths and misconceptions that they might have brought with them to their appointment. And another important point is letting them know where and how to access resources for continued use of the method if they need support. or if they're unhappy with the method and they want to discontinue or switch, also where they follow up to be able to do that. We're also aware that there are a number of barriers to address that we can't quite tackle ourselves, at least not on the demand side, such as those related to method availability and cost. But I think our review does kind of lay them bare in a way that they are certainly impediments to women using or even knowing about these methods that our research suggests that they would be interested in doing otherwise. And so I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And I wanted to give biggest shout out to my authorship team, several of whom are on this call. So a huge thank you to Anita Dam, Kate Morrison, Chastain Mann, Ashley Jackson, Shannon Bledsoe, Andrea Rowan, and Kim Longfield. This review took a lot of time and a lot of brain power, and it was absolutely a team effort. And I will put the link to the paper in the chat now, and I will turn it over to Beth, who is going to moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Yes, we're going to have time for question and answer. So if anyone does have some questions, comments, feel free to put it in the chat or just come off mute. We're not a huge group. Come off mute and feel free to comment or put out a question.
Hi, Danielle, this was
Hi,
great.
Barbara.
Hi, Barbara Friedland, Population Council. Thank you so much. So I had two questions. One was more logistical and just maybe it's in the paper, but do you know, I know how many articles, but do you know how many women this covers in all the various articles? So that was one question. But my other question was whether or not you have any insight about the partner concerns about the IUD, because, you know, I think we think often, you know, about whatever's going to have an impact on the partner himself, and one wouldn't think that an IUD would. So that was very interesting. And I don't know if it was concerns about future fertility or what the concerns. If you know any more about that, it would be great to hear about that.
Yeah, that is a great question, Barbara. First, we didn't record the number of women that were part of each study of each of the included articles. This would be something that we could go back and find out, but it would take a little bit of time. I think, you know, it's a really good point, and it's just not something that we built in from the beginning of the methodology. So I don't, unfortunately, have that number. And then on your second question about the insight on partner concerns. So I'm speaking mostly from memory here because I did a lot of the reviewing and the coding myself, along with Anita and Kate. And so the things that come to mind were that the partners of these women for the copper and hormonal IUD, there's obviously a lot more evidence related to the copper IUD, is that they come in with the same myths and misconceptions as the women do. So they are also under the impression, for example, that it causes cancer, and they want to protect their partners. So that is one of the concerns. They're also worried about side effects. So for the copper IUD, we know that there are a number of side effects that some women experience, and their partners don't want them to be uncomfortable or in pain. So that's one thing that comes to mind as well. Some of the studies didn't really dig into why partners didn't want them to, but it was kind of just like my partner said no, they just didn't want me to have this method. And then another aspect was that if the partner was concerned that it would interfere, like that it would, they would be able to feel it during sex, then that's something that they wouldn't want to deal with. So those are the ones that come to mind just from memory. And there are some more details in the paper, but those are the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. And any of the other authors that are on the call are more than welcome to come off and respond if anything else comes to mind for them as well.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for the question. And I had the same question about the IUD, so very, very interesting. Do we have any other questions? I don't see any in the chat, but again, if anyone wants to come off mute. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, Danielle and everyone. Really interesting work. Andrea Bear with USAID. Could you comment the extent to which you saw in the papers any data or insights around private versus public sector use and kind of the role of the providers in addressing, you know, user concerns and questions? And I know that wasn't the target of the paper, so, you know, of the research, but I'm just curious again, if you or any of the other researchers or authors had any takeaways kind of on these methods and kind of predominance by private versus public sector and the roles of the providers. Thanks. Over.
Thanks, Andrea. I can go first and then I'll open it up to the other authors as well. So unfortunately, I don't think that we have that much to say about private versus public, which I know is the crux of your question here. Where that came up more than anything was with cost. And that's where we saw, you know, price is definitely a concern in the private sector, but it also was in the public sector. In terms of the role of providers, you're right that that wasn't within the scope of our review, but I would say that quality counseling by providers or trained CHWs came out so strongly that women did talk a lot about what they viewed to be a quality counseling session, like what they wanted to know when they felt like a provider really gave them everything that they needed to understand to know what they were getting into. I would say that I don't think that we answer that question from maybe the angle that you're looking at, but from another one. And yeah, so I think the things that came out the most, which we talked about during this presentation, but just to highlight, would be making sure that women understand the what to expect. Like what's going to happen after they get the method, what side effects can they expect so that they're not caught off guard. And then also, where can they ask questions? That, you know, we saw that this was important for newer methods where they're not as familiar, they don't have friends that are familiar with these methods. So if they have questions, they want to go to a CHW or a provider to say, like, I'm having trouble inserting this diaphragm. Can you tell me, like, what am I doing wrong? Or, you know, something like that. And then similarly, along the same vein, the use of counseling tools was really useful for these newer methods or the methods that were less familiar. So for the diaphragm, for women being able to practice insertion on a pelvic model was really important. And then for the vaginal ring, in some of the research, they would talk about videos or counseling tools that were provided that women seem to really benefit from. So I don't know that I'm answering your whole question, but I think that's probably most of what I can say based on the review that we did. And if there's anyone else that wants to come off, or if you want to follow up on any of those points, Andrea, please feel free.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say a quick thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
And we have a question in the chat, although I think you sort of just addressed it, but I'll read it nonetheless and see if there's anything anyone would want to add. From Clancy, thank you for this presentation. With female condoms, we've seen that real-world clinical settings tend to provide less counseling and support for women to learn about vaginal insertion than research settings do, and uptake of the product is lower than expected. Do you have a sense of how well your findings from this lit review will translate to a real-world setting?
That's a good question. And, you know, off the top of my head, I can't. We had, I know, a number of articles feeding in to the female condom findings, and I imagine that most of them were from research settings. Let's see, I'm rereading this question so I make sure that I get it quite right. I mean, I think that Clancy, you're right on that real world clinical settings do tend to offer less counseling and support for women to learn about vaginal insertion and how to use these methods. I mean, I think that the findings would translate well, and that we would find that women still want these things. I think maybe, Clancy, do you mind coming off mute and talking a little bit more about your question, if it could be a bit more specific?
Well, I guess I was wondering if any of the studies, like if there was a variety of settings in which the studies were included, if they were really more in the initial stages of product introduction, where it would be more research-based setting, or they were moving towards more of what would be real world, and therefore what I think what I've observed is that it's harder to get the really strong counseling the further you are from the original pilots and product introduction in the research-based settings.
Yeah, I think that's true. So the included articles were from a variety of settings. That wasn't a limiting factor in when we looked at our inclusion and exclusion criteria. And for the female condom, we had a pretty healthy number of findings feeding into both adoption and continuation. I would say that most of what we were finding was on adoption. So in some ways, I think that we are thinking more about like earlier in the introduction process, but they weren't all research settings. So I want to make more inferences, but I'm afraid that based on what we have, or without looking closer at the like back at the research, that I can't make more inferences. So maybe I'll stop there before I get ahead of myself. Ashley, I saw you just came off mute, so if you want to add anything, please feel free.
Sure. Yeah, I recall when I was working on this with you that there were a lot of papers on the hormonal IUD as well, and that the female condom and hormonal IUD differ from the other three methods. And sorry, not the hormonal IUD, the copper IUD, copper IUD. But that the copper IUD and the female condom had, of these 5 methods, been on the market the longest and are, as Clancy said, the furthest from that initial introduction. So I would bet that those findings that are around the copper IUD, and then also to some extent the female condom, include many more of the papers looking at settings where you're far from the research setting. And this is mainstreamed into the method mix and programs that are ongoing. Whereas for vaginal rings and hormonal IUDs, it is mostly these early stage pilot introductions. This also touches on Andrea's question too, that with some of these methods, a lot of the evidence is only from the private sector, or mostly from the private sector so far, in terms of, well, actually the studies have focused more on the public sector, but some of these methods have been available through private providers like the hormonal IUD, but on a very small scale for a price that's unaffordable for many people. So we still have a lot to learn as some of these methods go to scale, if they go to scale, and more research will likely be needed in the future to see what works when you are farther from that initial introduction.
Thanks, Ashley. I feel like you helped put some of my thoughts into a much more eloquent statement, but I totally agree that it is the copper IUD and the female condom where we had more than just research settings, but the copper IUD is one by far. There was just so much more literature there.
Great, thank you both. A couple of questions have come in the chat, wondering if you were able to disaggregate some of this data. You know, one question is looking around location, so geographic location and region. Another one asking about socio-demographic variables. I wonder if you could speak a bit to, if you were able to disaggregate to that level at all, or had any findings come out clearly.
Yeah, so we didn't, so to Monica's question, I can't speak to whether, like how the findings are grouped by geographic location. Unfortunately, it was just out of the scope of what we could do in the time frame that we had. I can tell you that of the included articles, So I'm giving you like a piece of the answer. 54% were from Sub-Saharan Africa, 27 from Southeast Asia, 9 from East Asia and the Pacific, 5% from Latin America and the Caribbean, 3% from the Middle East and North Africa, and 1% of the articles were from countries in multiple regions. But unfortunately, we weren't able to look at how this impacted specific barriers or enablers. And then were you able to disaggregate the data by sociodemographic variables? Unfortunately, no, we were not. I think you probably got a clue just from talking through the data, but we bit off quite a bit. We had a lot of included articles. So we did unfortunately have to draw the line because of the extensiveness of the review about how deep we could go on some things, and geographic location and the demographic variables were two things that we couldn't incorporate.
Thanks, Danielle. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to come off mute for Danielle or any of the other authors on the call? I'm not seeing anyone coming off mute or raising their hand, and there's nothing else in the chat. Last chance. Well, I think we've all been really excited about seeing this publication come out. And as both Tab and Danielle mentioned, this is one of many brown bags. We're also going to have more dissemination around this publication. So we're excited to be continually sharing this and having touch points around this publication. You can find us at ICFP as well. So I think if there are no more questions, yeah, I think we can wrap it up. I don't know, Danielle, if you have any last words you want to share. Or...
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. This was very much a labor of love. It took us quite a long time to get this out. So we're excited to finally have it in the world. And in the publication, we really tried to be as transparent as possible about our entire process and how we went about this. So if you have more questions, I would be happy to answer them via email. You can reach out to me. Or if you want to check out the publication, there's quite a bit of information in the supplemental files.
And maybe just to add that I know there were a few people that weren't able to make it today, and maybe some of your colleagues, that this recording will be available on the Catalyst Global website. And so we'll also be sharing that link. And you can share it with others who might be interested.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, everyone.